Hi everyone, good afternoon and welcome to the RegTech Clusters webinar on responsible AI in RegTech. My name is Natasha O'Hay. I work for Catalyst, one of the founding members of the RegTech cluster. And we're delighted today to be working in partnership with Ulster University and AICC and look forward to hearing from Tag and Donica on this subject. I want to take just this opportunity to say a few words about our RegTech cluster. We have established the world's first multi-sectoral RegTech cluster. We work across borders, regulators, sectors with a smart specialisation in ESG and AI. We believe we are ideally placed as a region and an island to tap into the huge RegTech market opportunities with a strong track record in cross-collaboration and partnerships. The founding members of our cluster are Ulster University, Atlantic Technological University, Alpha Innovation, Derry City and Strabane District Council and Donegal County Council. As part of our cluster development over the past 2 years, we have hosted events, webinars, conferences, engaging industry, academia, regulators and government. And over the next few months, we want to speak to industry across the island of Ireland to understand your challenges, your opportunities, and we will use these insights to shape the activity we deliver in our cluster in 2026. I'll drop in the chat after this intro how to connect with us if you're interested in hearing more. Just a bit of housekeeping before we kick off. This webinar will be recorded and the link will be shared after the session. And we ask that if anyone has any questions, and please don't be shy, ask questions, to pop them in the chat function and we'll either answer them as we go along or we will if there's any kind of burning ones, we'll cover them at the end. So I suppose AI is a topic that is everywhere at the minute, and we're delighted to be bringing a webinar with the RegTech cluster on this theme. And I think it is going to change the world, but at the RegTech cluster, we're really passionate about making sure that the technology is used in a responsible and ethical way. So it's my pleasure to hand over to the AICC team for this webinar. Tag Hickey is the head of AI and digital ethics policy. Tag leads the national agenda on trustworthy and ethical AI, working at the intersection of technology governance and regulatory alignment and digital innovation. His colleague Donica Kirk is the Deputy Director of AI Technology Research Services, and Donica oversees the AI research and technical programs that enable industry and academia to develop the responsible AI solutions at scale. So over to Donica and Tag, and we're really looking forward to this session. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Natasha. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully we can all see the slides. I'm going to begin with a bit of an overview.
Do you want to just pop it into presenter mode? Yeah,
how's that?
All good now. Perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
I'm going to begin with a bit of an overview of the AICC, who we are, some kind of projects that we've worked on to give you a flavour of that. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Tag, who's going to do the meat of this presentation on our responsible AI, legal, regulatory side of things. Just briefly on me and my background, so I'm not a lawyer or a regulator at all. I was originally a research astrophysicist. I did that for about 10 years, building AI and machine learning tools to analyze telescope and satellite data. But there's not a lot of job security in it. So I made my way onto the commercial side of data science, which is what we called it at the time. I've worked in a variety of types of companies since then. I started off in a big buy-side investment firm in the City of London, 40,000 employees, $300 billion under management. Left there to return back to Belfast, where I'm originally from, in 2020 to work for a cloud consultancy company. So that's moving companies from old on-prem tech infrastructures into cloud-based workflows. And I was the head of the AI machine learning arm. And that was great because we worked with a real wide range of companies, from Florida insurance companies all the way through to Korean esports teams. And that was probably the best preparation I've had for the variety of stuff that we see at AICC. And then more recently, I worked for a cybersecurity startup as their head of AI before landing up at the AICC in February this year. The AICC, let's see if I can advance these slides. So we are easiest way I think I can summarize it is it's a proactive effort to turbocharge responsible AI adoption across Northern Ireland. And it's an effort from Department for the Economy and Invest NI. So they've put 16.3 million behind this project that funds us out until August 2029 at least. And we deliver across three main pillars that I'm going to talk about. And the team that does that is about 25 strong. We're still in the process of hiring some of those roles. There's a job ad out at the moment for an R&D director. There's a couple more jobs that are going to be advertised in the coming month or so. And at the top level, we're overseen by two different boards, industry-led advisory board and a technology and skills advisory board. The industry-led one is more on our core work with small, medium-sized enterprises that I'll talk more about in a moment. The technology and skills advisory board is on the skills development and research side of things. Both are predominantly industry representatives. Some of the same people that would be involved in RegTech will be there. I know FinTrue, for example, are highly involved in the RegTech supercluster, and Catherine Harkin from FinTrue is the chair of our industry advisory board. The Technology and Skills Advisory Board would have more representation from the universities, from FE colleges and so on, but it's still got a primarily industry background. And I just want, our head of marketing communications, Nicole, would kill me if I didn't bring your attention to aicc.co. That's our website. That's the #1 place to find news and information about AICC. So please, I'd advise people to go there and take a look occasionally to get updates on what we're doing, and also to follow us on LinkedIn. This is the org chart of the organization, just to give a flavor of the kind of people we have delivering the work. So we have a variety of professional functions, from our business development lead, Patrick McGurr, marketing. We run a lot of events, so we have a dedicated events organizer, Molly McDowell. Tag, who you're going to hear a lot from today, is our head of AI and digital ethics policy. And then I run our team of AI and machine learning engineers, who are split between applied researchers and data scientists, but all of them go into companies and deliver our AI proof of concept projects. And they also develop connections across the research ecosystem in Northern Ireland that I'll say a bit more about over the course of this. I should say, sort of practically, we're based out of both Queen's and Ulster universities. You can see some of the different home bases of people are listed here. We have physical footprint in the Ulster University campus in Magee in the northwest, York Street campus in Belfast, and Queen's in Belfast on the Malone Road. But our remit is all across Northern Ireland, and so we try and touch every corner, and we would like help to try to get our services into some of the slightly more underrepresented places that I'll say more about in a moment. We're based out of the universities, but no one in this org chart is an academic or a researcher. We work very closely with our colleagues. We're very happy that Brian Gardner, for example, who's organizing this call, is one of the co-Is of the AICC, but our team are 100% dedicated to the work we do across skills, direct SME support, and building that ecosystem of research collaboration. They're not researchers, they're engineers that work with companies every day of the week. I'll briefly touch on the three pillars that we deliver across: training, SME support, and research ecosystem. On the training side of things, we've got a few different levels. The most practical is probably 390 fully funded AI postgraduate scholarships. So this is money that's come from the Department for the Economy to pay the fees of 390 students over the lifetime of the AICC to do masters or postgraduate certificate, which is the sort of half a master's. They can do them full-time, they can do them part-time, they can do them at Magee, Ulster in Belfast, Coleraine, Queen's, in a variety of courses related to AI. I'll just actually jump forward to give you a flavor of what those look like. So there are core AI master's degrees at Queen's and Ulster. There's also data science, data analytics courses. There's a new responsible and ethical AI course being run out of Magee that's just started this academic year. That's more aimed at not hands-on keyboard technical folks, but it would be a sort of CEO, CTO, CFO of a company that wants to learn more about concepts and very appropriate for this audience, regulatory and legal aspects of deploying AI as a business. And then we have a variety of more specialized courses in everything from smart manufacturing, bioinformatics, engineering disciplines, where there's a strong AI machine learning component to the course. It's something that can be funded. So our latest cohort of students have just started in September there, but there's still about 130 places available that would start next September. So if you know anyone that might be interested in those courses, please send them our way. Below that level of commitment, the full master's or postgraduate certificate programs, we run online short courses. And these are the kind of things you'd study in your own time. They'd be sort of web-based content that you can consume when you like. At the moment, we run one flavor of that, and that's really aimed at professionals working in industry that are interested in AI but haven't done any qualifications or had much practical experience in it. And so it's kind of orienting them with where the value might be for them and their organization. Recently, we hired Geraldine Doherty as our head of skills. And so she's actively building out additional courses at the moment. So there will be more technical offerings on particular technologies, but also be more conceptual offerings on the kind of stuff that Tag works on and is going to talk about here around regulation and ethical and responsible deployment of AI. This is probably our most flexible thing we do. So we're able to create our content. And so we're in the market for ideas about what would be useful. So if anyone in this call does have ideas for training materials that they'd like for themselves or for their organization, get in touch with us. We'd love to hear about them. Similarly, we actually then go out across Northern Ireland and run workshops. Again, we've primarily targeted them at small, medium enterprises that are looking to adopt AI in their processes. Additional types of content there. So again, please, if you've got ideas for half a day or full day workshop style interactive training sessions that you'd love to see, whether that's on a particular technology or more conceptually about how do you even think about applying AI tooling to an organization, we'd love to hear about it. Our second pillar is hands-on support for SMEs. So this is where me and my team spend most of our time. Any small medium enterprise in Northern Ireland can come to the AICC and ask for 20 days of support to build out an AI proof of concept. It's totally free to the company at the point of use. Obviously, we're very conscious that we're ultimately taxpayer funded and all these businesses are paying their rates, but there's no barrier in terms of a cost at the moment of taking up the support offer. And unlike some university collaborations, 100% of any IP generated stays with the company. So it's got to hit those two elements for us to take it on. It's got to have an AI component. So we're relatively broad in what we mean here. We can talk a little bit about some practical examples in a moment, but we're not going to turn someone away because they bring a more traditional data science or machine learning ask. But what we are not here to do is straight software development. And we do sometimes get people asking for that kind of thing. We're not here to displace the native software dev industry. We're here because lots of companies out there have great AI or machine learning ideas, but they don't have the confidence to go and pay for them to be made reality. So we're here to do a proof of concept. So again, we're not building a fully working production ready system. We're proving that there is a certain technology choice, a certain combination of data that can realize the value that the company thinks is there. And then the company needs to take that proof of concept on either internally if they've got the skills, or they go to a commercial partner to build that out into a fully integrated, quality assurance tested product in the market. And then the goal is that we're going to support at least 248 SMEs through this program over the lifetime of AICC. I've talked about how we have the goal and the ambition of working all across Northern Ireland. I think we're doing quite well so far. You can see from our SME heat map on the right hand side that understandably we've got it really tracks population. We've got a decent chunk in Belfast. We're doing pretty well in the Northwest as well. We don't have so much in the sort of Fermanagh direction, although we have baselined this against where technology companies are based across Northern Ireland, and we're doing significantly better in terms of regional diversity than tech companies are, but we want to do more. So if anyone has any leads on companies down in the kind of Oma and Enniskillen directions, we'd love to hear about them. I'm just going to take a break before I talk about the third pillar and hand over to Tag to talk about a few particular companies that we've worked with. I'm going to zip through them quickly, but I'm very happy to answer any questions on them now or towards the end of the call. I've anonymized them just because some of the projects are still underway at the moment, so I don't want to name the companies we wrap up. This is a local IT audit firm, so they would go into a company and they would check, are your internal processes compliant with whatever the relevant regulations are, whether it's NIST, ISO 27001, or whatever. Very manual process. Small number of extremely knowledgeable people that have been in the industry for 30 or 40 years, totally bottlenecked by their ability to be on site with a company and work with them. So they're looking to build automated AI-powered processes that can replace some of that labor and accelerate their ability to do these audits. This is going beyond sort of vanilla large language model deployments in a number of different directions. You're having to gather a lot of the regulations that they have to comply with change quite regularly. So you're looking to draw that information down live rather than have static snapshots of it. And then you need to go into whatever way a company describes its own processes and chunk that up into relevant components that you can compare against the regulation. So there's a dynamic element there of going in, grabbing chunks of data, and then building prompts, the kind of stuff you throw into a large language model on the fly using a library called DSPy, so that you can interrogate, does this particular element of the company process document, is it in compliance with the regulation? Is it out of compliance, or is it in partial compliance? And then obviously you can see that there's a difficulty here in terms of you can be out of compliance because you just don't mention something in your regulation. So that has to be handled as well. The whole thing is orchestrated through a framework called LangChain, which is a tool for orchestrating complex processes using multiple large language model calls. And it's been pretty successful. And you can see the example dashboard that we built out on the right-hand side. This is doing an analysis on a single company, and you're seeing elements of their process that have been highlighted as either out of compliance in red, in compliance in green, or partially compliant in amber. And then you get a kind of prior, where should that company put its next marginal piece of effort for maximum impact in terms of getting back into compliance. I move on to the next company. This is an established local tech firm that specializes in financial sector work. They do a lot of know your customer anti-money laundering stuff with big international financial institutions, banks, among others. And what they find is they've built a great software suite using machine learning models to identify signals of interest for these kind of things. But when they bring them into any particular new institution, there's always a huge amount of bespoking they've got to do. And there's a complicated human feedback process they've got to get where they roll their tool out and they get a lot of feedback about what's working well, what's not working well. Often some of the feedback isn't very high value and they need to exclude that when they do their next iteration and update the process. And they came to us and said, can we build some mechanism for automating that feedback process? And so we're using the flexibility of modern large language models to ingest complex, unstructured natural language feedback from customers and integrate it into a workflow where we sort of triage it. Some of the feedback gets thrown out as not being actionable. Some of it gets automatically introduced and the product gets updated. And some of it gets summarized and turned into a report that a human can review and decide whether and what tools to implement. Third of four, a local legal tech startup. So this is in some ways kind of the simplest of the bunch, but it's very powerful. So they want to give advice on planning applications, and they want to use the power of large language models to allow a chat style interface. So their customers don't have to spend very expensive hours talking to a lawyer. If they have preliminary questions, simple questions, if they want to just chat in advance of a meeting with a lawyer so they clarify their thoughts, they can talk to a proprietary chatbot in this company's systems. But that chatbot needs to have very precise, accurate information about Northern Ireland specific planning law. There's no point it coming back with a mishmash of German planning law and Australian planning law and American planning law. And so we built for them what's called a RAG system, retrieval augmented generation, where they have a very specific database of documents. And when you ask a question, the RAG system goes off and finds, like looking up a name in a phone book, which are the chunks of information in those documents that are relevant to this question. And then it makes the large language model answer only with that context in mind, not anything else it might have been trained on in its history. And I think what I like about this is the first of the 3 use cases that we've talked about that actually looks like a human typing into a chatbot, right? And one thing we do find with our customers that come to us is AI has never been such a big part of the global conversation, but what people mean has almost never been so narrow. It's all focused on Copilot, ChatGPT, sitting and typing into a large language model chat interface. And so a lot of our time is spent trying to open the eyes of companies to say there's a huge amount of ways of deploying AI outside of that. So both the previous examples, they use the power of large language models, but they're built into background workflow systems. They're not interacting directly with the user in either case. And then lastly, before I hand over to Tag, just one more example. So this is a local biotech inspection company. So they've got a large amount of, they go into wet labs and they see, are they compliant with health and safety and other regulations? And it's very manual the way they do it. What they came to us and they said, we don't want help automating the process that we currently do. We would like to derive new data products from the data that we already have and pick out things like how do we automatically identify a chain of laboratories that have repeatedly got the same kind of infraction, even if it might be on different sites separated by months or years in time. And so this is using what we might consider more old-fashioned NLP, natural language processing tools like topic modeling, for example, where we go and we say, the kind of infraction, the language used might be subtly different from one report to another. You're talking about different auditors, maybe years apart, but we have a machine learning powered pipeline that can identify they're actually talking about the same thing in this scenario and on this other scenario. And so this is, old-fashioned in some ways. And the other thing we got to, and where old-fashioned means maybe 10-year-old technology, and something that we find is companies can be disappointed when you explain to them the tooling that you're going to use for a particular solution because they want the newest, the shiniest, the most advanced model. And so there's a job of work to say, look, this is more effective for the need that you've actually identified. And it's also a hell of a lot cheaper, more robust, easier to maintain on your side. But really, at the moment, it's an uphill battle to even make that argument because there's such a focus on those most advanced frontier models. I'll stop there. I should just mention briefly the third pillar that we work on. So we've got the skills side, the direct SME support, and then we're also here to try to be a front door to wider research initiatives across academia and where they could partner with industry. So there's already a huge amount of great work going on there, but we think it can grow a lot over the next year, 2 years, 5 years. I think one big barrier for a lot of companies, particularly SMEs, is there's such a wide range of ways to collaborate with academics that it can be very confusing. So I've just done a small snapshot of what's available here, all the way from taking a master's student for 12 weeks doing their thesis project at the end of their degree, all the way up to applying for big multi-million-dollar, multi-year national and international grants jointly with academics and everything in between. So the AICC is broadly like the front door. We have this great network of academics at our disposal, and we can connect companies into them and identify what level, what's the right fit size for a collaboration at the level of maturity the company is at. And then either our team can remain involved as the project is fleshed out, grants are applied for, the work begins, or we can just step back and the academics and the company can take it from there. So I'm going to stop at that stage. I'm very happy to answer any questions on the AICC in general, or to pass over to Tag, who's going to talk in more detail about responsible AI.
Thanks, Donica. And just in that as well, if anyone does have a question and they don't want to shout about it out loud, we are also very happy that you put them in the chat and we'll answer them there. So in that case, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started on our main section. So this part of the session, we're going to explore how responsible AI is transforming or augmenting RegTech and how it's moving from compliance driven to more of a strategic foundation for trust and competitiveness. We're going to walk through how AI and RegTech are converging, and then the governance frameworks, regulations, and strategy, and then how all of this kind of builds into a trustworthy infrastructure. So just to start, we're going to go through 6 parts from the convergence, as I said: responsible AI imperative, governance and ethics frameworks, regulatory landscapes, using responsible AI as your strategic enabler for this relationship, and then closing on that overall trust framework. Now, at this and the heart of this is the intersection of RegTech and AI. And if we think about how RegTech is already transformed from compliance, it's been made faster, there's more data-driven decisions, it's more consistent, but artificial intelligence kind of provides an opportunity to move not just where compliance is automated, but where it's now more intelligent. Or rather than saying more intelligent, it supports more intelligent insights. With that, if we look at this, RegTech kind of began as a way to digitize compliance. We went through rule interpretation, reporting, and now AI brings in this new dimension of prediction and insights. And together, these now translate complex regulatory rules into actionable data-driven compliance systems. But the advantage of this intersection is now spotting risk before it materializes and proactively engaging with it. This kind of new advantage and intersection is where you run into a bit of risk. Where are you sure that it's working? How can you rely on it? And that's when we're going to talk a little bit more about not just this convergence, but where this reasoning relies on trust, oversight, and accountability, and that being built into the systems. So if you are having either a direct system or a process which is supported by AI now coming into this space, it needs to be adaptive and responsive, but you need to rely on it. It needs to be trustworthy. And they're really important components. Otherwise, you're going to have AI as this fancy labeled market capture that just doesn't deliver. And you lose trust, you lose availability, you lose product. With that, we're going to talk about adaptive regulation today. So this intersection of the Venn diagram, this convergence, as I've said, is what the World Economic Forum refers to as adaptive regulation. It sits right there in the middle. However, adaptive regulation doesn't just exist in its own silo. So with this, we're going to take a look at what it means, that flexible approach that evolves alongside technology and market change, what gives you that ability to progress over time, to grow, and you respond to emerging risks. However, if we're going to look at that, we then need to think about what's coming alongside it. What are the main levers? How does adaptive regulation fit into this? And the main thing that fits into it is that it's bringing in flexibility, it's bringing in iterative learning, and it's bringing data-driven oversight. And AI is now acting as a highly empowered engine to prove and bring all these things into RegTech. Now, one of the main considerations is that this is built on flexibility, and we need to consider what that looks like so we have trustworthy innovation. So if this intersection relies on adaptiveness and an ability to be flexible, how can we ensure that it's bringing trust and reliability into this space? And that's where we have trustworthy AI in terms of responsible AI. Now, I'm going to refer to this today as the responsible AI imperative. When we look at this imperative, this central space, we're going to see increasing challenges about where people are displaying this use of AI. This RegTech and AI convergence, then the requirement for adaptive regulation brings you into responsible AI. But what's responsible AI going to do? Well, it's going to give you that flexibility, and you're going to look about how your systems and your processes remain ethical, transparent, and worthy of trust. So when regulation becomes intelligent, trust is now the currency of compliance. So one of the main things that we need to think about is that how do we bring this responsible AI to get that trustworthy currency? Because if you want to show market trust, you want to be a differentiator. You need to show that you're compliant. You need to show that you can deliver in a reliable fashion. So one of the things we're going to look at is these catalysts. What do they lead to when we speak of responsible AI? Well, globally, we do see alignment. We have the OECD's principles on human-centered, transparent AI. We have the EU AI Act, which is the first legal-based framework available for AI globally. Now, at the moment in Northern Ireland, it doesn't holistically apply. There's only a small niche area which applies to products, and those specific products will be around health and safety. There is a debate as to how far it will go, but something to bear in mind is that if you do deliver product or service in other jurisdictions, the EU AI Act is going to be relevant. And even if not wholly applicable in Northern Ireland, it is very useful to look at what's allowed, how to show and demonstrate compliance, because a lot of the principles and approaches within it are consistent. And then beyond that, we have the UK's pro-innovation approach. It's principle-led under DCIT, and alongside that, there's common principles which have been outlined. So when we look at responsible AI today, we're going to look at 4 components to talk about how you bring that governance from compliance to a strategic enabler. With that, we're going to look at governance by design, the regulatory landscape, strategic enabler, and then we're going to look at a trust infrastructure. And all of these components together are going to bring you into that journey from moving from compliance into that strategic enabler. So one of the main things is that compliance technologies already fall under standards, and that can be from AI-driven KYC systems to financial anomaly detection tools. However, they currently classify as high risk under the EU AI Act, and that means there are certain levels of fairness, explainability, and oversight which have to be included in their design and their operations. So what we're finding is responsible AI just doesn't follow these systems. The fact is it has to build in these rules to make sure that they're acting for good. So in this first part, we're going to look at these governance frameworks, and we're going to label it as governance by design. So how do we make that responsible AI real? Well, we do it through this governance by design. We embed ethics and accountability throughout the entire life cycle of AI. So when we look at this, governance by design operationalizes ethics. So at the beginning, you might have design, which focuses on defining the purpose of your AI in the RegTech space. Why would you use it? Is that going to be augmenting a role, augmenting a process, or is it going to do something independent? And then you're thinking of fairness. Do you have the right approach? Is it dealing with a representative data set? Have I thought about conducting impact assessments? So the RegTech model kind of is already designed to minimize bias against protected groups. But when you apply AI, you need to think about, is this AI introducing any unintended bias? Have I considered that and what it's going to do? When we move beyond design, we start to think about development. And when we're in development, we're thinking about building integrity and transparency. We're showing bias testing, data provenance, and essentially we create this thing called ethics gates. So an ethics gate is basically, here's the level that a solution has to perform for us to say that it's been developed to a point where we're happy to try and move it into deployment. And those ethics gates to be the unique standards where it's actually providing reliable and accurate results. It's in its potential to integrate into a process isn't really a replacement, it's an augmentation. And you might show that, you know, those results are backed up, particularly in the RegTech space, by an evidence basis. We've seen the examples earlier from Donica around some of the SMEs that we had worked with. One of the core components to each one of their AI journeys is the simple fact that they had to have an evidence-based output, which showed that if AI was going to deliver something, it had to show a roadmap of how it got there. So even though there's a black box component, an unknown component to how LLMs work, that it had to provide the evidence as to this is where I find the information, here you can check. So it gives that validation, you build up that trustworthiness, and you do that with accountability and transparency at the key. This also means you have to think about diverse data sets. And one of the big things is documenting what you're doing with AI. So sometimes this is referred to as model cards. What are you using AI to do? Can you summarize what type of AI or what that process looks like? And they're incredibly helpful. But a model card isn't very difficult. You just need to make sure you have that recording so you understand what's happened and where you're going. Beyond that, we get to deployment, where we ensure explainability or evidence-based and informed use. You know, if you're going to use AI in that intersection, right, that convergence with RegTech, you're going to have to communicate it, because otherwise you're going to get into trouble. You might find that people say that you're unduly using their data, or you have unconsented data usage, and you want to avoid that. One of the big things that kind of shows this from a deployment and an oversight perspective is dashboards. Donica already alluded to that in one of his examples, and that shows how decisions are made. It's backing up and proving from an evidence basis. This is how AI is interacted in this process. Now you have the opportunity to take that further. So you can remediate harm only if you have the information available to tell you where it is. And that brings us to that final step here, which when we look at governance by design, we look at oversight, which is continuous accountability and redress, where you monitor for drift. So although regulations and rules are changing, AI is also changing at a very quick pace. And we need to be able to shift and react to it or proactively engage it. So we have to monitor for drift. Is there a change in the outcome? Should I review any incidents? Well, yes, you should. And then by embedding this, we start to see that governance becomes seamless. And instead of like regulation and this tech acting as like a reactive step, we're now proactively addressing where it could fit in. And that convergence offers that opportunity. But governance by design starts us off in a safe space to integrate AI. When we look at those examples here, you know, as I said, there are lots of frameworks which exist. OECD AI principles, UNESCO's ethics of AI principles. You have ISO standards, which now are specifically designed for AI-based products. And there's 4 that go from risk management, stakeholder management to actual integration within a project. You have the NIST 2, which operationalizes AI into certifiable standards. And the base, you kind of have the EU AI Act and the UK DCIT framework. So all of these are coming in, but to be very honest, there is consistency in the approach, which is looking at design, development, deployment, and oversight, and then bringing in these areas of focus to them. If we go to the next area of what that responsible AI imperative looks like, it's the regulatory landscape, because AI is becoming increasingly embedded across multiple regulatory layers. Now, I've picked a few that I'm going to focus on today. Now, some of them do focus on kind of a core layer where these frameworks connect, they build that responsibility, they define behavior, and they ensure the resilience. But one of the big things to note about the regulatory landscape for AI at the moment is that it's not just demanding trustworthy algorithms. They are demanding resilient, explainable, and auditable systems, whereby you can follow through how an AI is acted. Because one of the biggest questions that often comes my way is, if the AI goes wrong, who's going to be liable? And the best response that I can give, well, it's not going to be the AI, right? It's going to be the person in charge of that system, the organization in charge of it, because AI in itself is not a data controller. So if you're interacting with it and something goes wrong, the liability is going to be with the organization responsible for it, or the individual in some cases. So just as we move into this, the regulatory landscape, we might have a core layer. And at that core layer, let's talk about AI legislation. And the biggest one we can talk about at the moment is the EU AI Act. It is the first comprehensive law regulating AI, and it defines AI and how it should behave, but it takes a risk-based approach. So there are prohibited uses for AI. There are high-risk uses for AI. And then with those, they have corresponding obligations for transparency, for fairness, and human oversight. So as you can see, its core makeup kind of comes under these 4 categories. But AI isn't just about the legislation, because at the moment, you know, the UK has a very pro-innovation approach, which isn't defining a full legislative framework. So in this case, you might have other influential factors. Now, one of the big things I can give as an example for the EU AI Act in action is if you were to use an AI system in financial compliance, credit scoring, or fraud detection, all of those would be under a high risk category. And that's where basically the EU AI Act is saying, well, you have to be more explainable in how you got to a decision or you got to a particular layer of data. You need to test this for bias to make sure it doesn't have an undue impact. And you need to have auditability built in from the outset, which means here's how my process works. Here is what has happened at each stage. So the Act is looking at AI becoming powerful, but it's trying to match it up to say it has to be accountably managed, protecting both the markets and the users. On our second layer, this middle layer, we might have something like DORA and the NIS2, which are looking not just at AI algorithms and models, but they're looking at how running actual AI needs to be resilient, secure, and dependable. So when we look at that, we're now looking at the resilience, building sustainable AI solutions. And when I talk about sustainable, I don't just mean sustainable from an energy position, important, but I mean, is that impact going to be felt down the line? So if we look at the core makeup here, we might consider it to be resilience testing, incident management, and traceability. DORA looks at, ensures that financial entities can withstand and recover from any technology disruption. AI brings in that opportunity. And at the moment, AI is not just a great solver, it's also a great threat because people see it as the opportunity to disrupt, and it's a bit of a target. Alongside that, though, here you would really look at your robust incident testing, your monitoring, and your third-party risk management. So you'd look at what vendors are offering in that space. So all of these build in, once again, you're looking at cybersecurity, traceability, and reporting. Now, one of the things to mention is cybersecurity is not disunique or ununique to AI. There are specific cybersecurity standards which have now emerged from the ETSI, the European Telecommunications Standard Institute, which focus on cybersecurity for AI and making sure that it's resilient over time. And it does that through 13 principles, which you can align to other governance frameworks already, ISO, OECD. However, it also provides 72 provisions to prove that compliance. So as we're going along, the reason why we talked about that flexibility in adaptive regulation is because AI in itself is in an adaptive period where people are trying to figure out how to govern it. Beneath that, then, you might have an outer layer, and this is where we might see market regulation focused on how AI impacts society or specific markets. The Digital Services Act or the Digital Market Act, they already create new rules for algorithmic transparency, content accountability, and looking at fair competition in digital ecosystems. Now, this is just an example of what could impact, particularly in the RegTech space, but this is essentially bringing in an air of, once again, transparency, accountability, and barreling this into a term called responsible innovation. The UK's DSA, so the Department of Science, Innovation Technology, already takes a principle-based approach, and it aligns, once again, to safety, transparency, fairness, accountability. And the big one that it adds in under responsible innovation is contestability. If something happens with an AI, I should be able to challenge it as a user, and we should have an ability to address or redress something. If we go beyond this, then just one last point I'll bring home in this. These areas really focus on essentially bringing together three things. The core layer defines how AI might behave. The middle layer operationalizes it. So this is how your AI operates in a process. And then the final one looks at impact. It shapes how your AI might impact society or business or users. And when you consider all of these things, you now start to marry and mirror what a regulatory landscape looks at for responsible AI. Now, the last two ones I'm going to talk about here are strategic enabler. So if compliance ensures survival, we see responsible AI bringing in that trust. So firms we're finding with the responsible AI framework are actually seeking approval much faster. They get a compliance lens. There's a strategic lens to it, and they're moving from risk avoidance into value creation, essentially saying good governance becomes the foundation for innovation moving forwards. And here, we will share these slides after with everyone, but it gives kind of some of the criteria which you'd be looking for. So here's your current compliance lens. This is how responsible AI reshifts that. And, now, as you can see, the core takeaway here is you move from a defensive control to proactive innovation. In the second space, we might look at siloed ethics turning into an embedded culture. So previously, ethics or data governance may have been seen as a separate department, and now we're seeing it embedding itself almost everywhere. It's a shared responsibility, and it's not part of it's part of culture, not compliance anymore. So you're driving consistency across people's interactions. So no longer does it have to sit by itself by expert individuals. You're now bringing everyone along on that journey. So we're dissolving silos with this AI intersection and that responsible component. We then have moving away from reactive audits to continued assurance. And this is the big kind of change in the RegTech space, which we'd like to see responsible AI kind of bring in. So instead of being retrospective compliance, something like we'll build something and then audit it later, there's now a model which is really focusing on continuous assurance, which is real-time monitoring, bias detection, bringing in those explainability dashboards, and tracking system performance as it evolves rather than after the fact. So essentially, AI in this intersection, this divergence with RegTech is really looking at the practice of assurance as active, adaptive, and data-driven. It's not a reactive. We're moving into continuous compliance. And then we have the last one, which is, Donica gave the example earlier, but static reporting of point in time now comes to predictive governance. So instead of looking backward to figure out what may have gone wrong, we start to use data analytics to look forward. We identify emerging risks, we look at market changes or bias trends, and they become proactively engaged before they're a compliance issue. So the responsible AI component at that convergence is turning governance into foresight to say, we don't have to wait till something happens. We're now changing this into foresight to say, here's how we're going to predict an event. Here's how we're actually going to proactively manage that so that if it does happen, we are much more ready instead of trying to scramble. And what all of this does is build up kind of the final component that I'll talk about, which is trustworthy infrastructure. So we've seen how this intersection, that responsible AI imperative, is driving performance and trust within organizations. But the reality is that trust doesn't stop there. It has to extend beyond the enterprise. So you might look across a wider ecosystem of government, industry, academia, and society, right? And the next step is scaling your trust. So you build the infrastructure that not just underpins every responsible innovation, but now underpins your relationships to prove that, hey, we're doing this in a safe and reliable way. And with that, you might look at different strands of how you build an ecosystem to support your trust infrastructure. So if you're looking at this convergence, here's some of the relationships you would think of, or some of those that you should take note of. The first may be government, which kind of trust begins there. It sets frameworks, policies, guardrails that define accountability. We already see that in the UK with our common principles. We see it with the ICO as a body representing. We see it with other standards. We see it with the EU legislation. In Northern Ireland, we have the new Office for AI and Digital, which is going to bring out a strategy which is looking at AI policies and use. It's something to bear in mind. From there, we might look into industry, where you have the implementation of governance and innovation standards. And this industry really brings frameworks to life, right? It translates the standards from policy into practice. So we're now looking at the space, defining those expectations, but it's the responsible AI component which is delivering the adoption that people can trust. Because as Donica and I always talk about, the team, particularly at the AICC, can build anything, but our question is not, can we build anything? We always start with should. And that's with engaging with the experts who are going to be using it, engaging with people that know the demographic that make up their user base. Donica mentioned it already, but one of the core components to a trustworthy infrastructure is making sure you engage with that academia, driving research and the validation, because evidence-based policy is better than words on a page. So they don't just help engage and define these components, they help regulate and build the AI, which is grounded in science, essentially verified AI usage through data and continuous improvement. So it provides some independent scrutiny, and it gives both the first two components, government and industry, kind of an eye of scrutiny into where AI sits in that shared space, that convergence. Now, the last one here is society. And if we frame society, this is your citizens, your users, your community, and it sits at the heart of any ecosystem. It demands transparency and legitimacy. So even if you didn't have all of those frameworks, those principles in place, people themselves have an expectation that what they're engaging with is safe. They have an expectation they can trust it because it's experts that tell them to do so. And you need to bring them on that journey. It's basically, if you cannot do that, you don't really have a license to operate because you can't get anyone to buy in. Now, once again, what are the components to kind of build this up? Well, if we look at this living infrastructure, right, which is saying these are relationships which I'll hold as I look at my responsible AI in this intersection, well, then we need to consider, once again, looking at fairness, which builds that social inclusion, accountability, which builds up that regulatory confidence, and then we have transparency, building the legitimacy. They are three key enablers to building up this infrastructure. Now, all of these kind of build into that component of, if you're looking at the intersection, right, the convergence of RegTech and AI, there's a great opportunity to bring in new adaptive regulation. And the World Economic Forum has already recognized this. However, one of the core components to adaptive regulation is responsible AI. And if you're looking at responsible AI, you would cover kind of those governance frameworks, the governance by design, the regulatory landscape, the trustworthy infrastructure, and looking at responsibility and safety as a strategic enabler. Now, I'm going to pause myself here to say one last little plug. Just like Donica mentioned, the AICC is here to talk all things AI. One of the things that we're releasing very soon will be the Responsible AI Hub. This is a brand new space on our AICC.co, which is dedicated to all things responsible AI, from early intervention practical tools to introductions to topics, and there will be specific guidance around particular industries or other use cases. So if you do, I would say it's worthwhile to follow the Responsible AI Hub. And the last point is from our marketing person, if I didn't say, if you want to stay in touch with us, the best place to follow us is on LinkedIn. It shows all of AICC events. It also is where we share responsible AI guidance. So a little plug for myself there. It's where we do share that guidance. And if you do have any use cases or queries, we're always happy to engage with them. I'm going to cut myself there, pass back over to Natasha. If we have time for a few questions, Donica and I are here, but also gives you the opportunity to wrap up.
Perfect. Thank you, Tag and Donica. I think there's one question or a few questions maybe in the chat, if we could cover them quickly. So a lot of AI used by firms is owned and controlled by and influenced by certain companies from certain parts of the world. I believe that ethics has to look beyond responsibility. Do you think these ethical implications of power legitimacy of these big players that may mean that RegTech becomes less impartial than it should be, and that these things should be considered in any approach to responsible AI?
Perfect. So I'm happy to answer this one first, and then Donica, you might want to add in from a technical perspective. Listen, there are different balances of power when it comes to particular models and frontier models in particular. From a usage perspective, there's a dependency that is building, and unfortunately, responsible AI and ethics is defined by the groups that are building them. However, the legislative frameworks, all the principle bases are all driving that you have to be representative and transparent as to how things are interacting. The second component, which I'm going to follow in here, is a lot of the use cases that we're seeing is when you actually don't rely specifically on a frontier model, but you may take a copy of it, you may adapt it to make sure that you prove in particular components. I think Donica's example earlier of the legal tech example, which relied on a RAG, basically said, I want the power of the technology, but I need to change the rule basis to be more reliable and consistent. And that's because it was like looking at accuracy of outcome. So there is a debate around that at the moment, and I'd love to say there's a very black and white answer. There is a power imbalance depending where you get your model from. We have seen differences in bias or some of the training data which has been used. However, that's when, if you're looking at a specific use case, the bolt-ons which you can add, and Donica, I'll come to you in a second just to maybe talk about that, is where you build in this responsible component to say that, listen, we're not going to be as influenced. We're going to keep our impartiality because we've built these bolt-ons for a reliable solution. Donica, you might want to add on there.
Yeah, just say, look, it's a great question, and there's such a variety of ways in which these ethical issues might make themselves known for you in your use case. So it could be that you object to the purveyor of a particular AI model for totally unrelated reasons. You know, some people would dislike Grok because of Elon Musk's extracurricular activities outside of XAI. You might object to the specific implementation of things in the model. Bias, as Tag mentioned, famously, if you ask the DeepSeek Chinese model about details of the Tiananmen Square massacre, it won't answer. You might dislike generally the way the models are trained, you know, huge wholesale appropriation of copyrighted material, for example. I'd say, without diminishing or dismissing any of those concerns, I'd say that this is a continuum with existing ethical worries around large tech companies in general, rather than something that is uniquely different about the AI models themselves. And I would say that where I think there are partial tech, I guess, and the other thing to say is, I unfortunately, I don't think there's any such thing as fair trade AI. You know, there's no clean model that doesn't have some combination of the concerns that I've just mentioned involved in it. And I didn't even talk about energy and water usage as well, which is obviously massive as well. Where I think there's one element of sort of technical control that you can have in your hands is when I mentioned about right sizing your model usage, right? What we find is a lot of companies will default to the most advanced frontier models from the household name companies, ChatGPT, GPT-5 from OpenAI, the likes of the most up-to-date Anthropic models, and so on. If you don't need all that firepower in your particular application, using a smaller open source, open weight model where you can run it locally on-prem and it's not going to get altered or removed by someone outside of your control, can be very valuable. Doesn't take away all of those ethical concerns, but it gives you a certain level of security and confidence in the deployment that you are doing, if that's appropriate for you. Tons of technical detail we could get into there. I'm happy to talk to anyone that might be interested in those kind of things in detail. But yeah, great question. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. I think we're running out of time to answer any other questions, but definitely I find that really interesting. And Donica, great to get an overview of all the great work that AICC is doing. And we're happy as a RegTech cluster and Catalyst and even the community here to try and spread the word. And, you know, as you said, it's important that businesses understand AI and, you know, kind of even the basic element of it. I think, you know, one of the things when I'm looking at that kind of adaptive regulation and when we're looking at RegTech, it's kind of the roles of the regulators. I think it's a really interesting one, and I know we're not going to cover it in this section, but it might be something that we could maybe pick up in the next section. You know, how do we work closer with the regulators as the speed of the technology is at a different pace potentially to what regulators are used to working to. So I think for me, that's the kind of thing that I keep thinking as you're going through this. Where's the regulator's role? And in the RegTech cluster, we're very keen to engage with the regulator to see is there a way in which we can all work together so that people get those efficiencies and competitiveness in the global market. So thank you very much, Tag and Donica, and thanks to everyone for taking the time today. We will share the link for this webinar after the session, as well as the details for the RegTech cluster and the AICC. But please do keep an eye out on more stuff. And this, if you use the QR code, you can get to our website. But thanks again, and I hope everybody has a great rest of their Wednesday.